Repent, the end is near. Well, for the Super Committee at least, they've got less than 2 weeks to figure out how to shave $1.3 trillion off the deficit. Miss that November 23rd deadline and they'll trigger draconian slate of budget cuts. Let's bring back the roundtable. So, John, is the Super Committee going to make this deadline?
From all of my talks with people on the Hill, the Super Committee is on the brink of failure. And barring an 11th minute breakthrough that we don't see any signs of right now, it will fail. It will fail to produce. Now, it may, my prediction is that they do something, but it'd be a much smaller number than $1.2 trillion, and it will be seen, as it should be, as a failure. Donna,
Senator Mitch McConnell thinks that this is all a White House design. Let's just put this up and see what the senator just said this week.
It does raise your suspicion that the folks down at the White House are pulling for failure. Because you see, if the Joint Committee succeeds, it steps on the storyline that they've been peddling, which is that you can't do anything with the Republicans in Congress.
What about your storyline?
Oh, I don't think so. Look, the White House has put forward a big deal, a big bargain, you know, with more cuts than that most Democrats will basically say, no way, let's not cut so deeply into the entitlement programs. This is still about the Bush tax cuts. It's still about raising revenue. And the Republicans have not put forward a reasonable plan to really, you know, make a deal with the Democrats. So I see a deadlock, and I also believe they're going to kick this down the road.
They wanted more revenues, the Democrats did. So Pat Toomey, former chairman of the Club for Growth, taxophobic if anyone is, put forward hundreds of billions of dollars in new revenues by largely devaluing deductions for high earners. In other words, making the tax code more progressive. And the Democrats again moved the goalposts and says we're not going to do that. Now, the real deadline is not the 23rd, it's the 21st. They've already blown past one deadline. They had to get their plan scored. The 21st, they have to have it published for 48 hours before the deadline. What happens if the sequester trigger comes into play? Nothing. Nothing happens on the 24th because the sequester works in 2013. Furthermore, you can draw a graph. This is federal spending without the sequester. This is federal spending with the sequester. It's a tiny difference. It's a tiny difference in the rate of growth of federal spending.
What's at stake here for you and for your sort of constituents? Is this going to work, do you think? And the sequester that George is talking about, if it does go into effect, it really heavily affects military spending.
Yes, and that's sort of, I think, one of the big problems that grassroots conservatives especially had with this whole situation is that it really focuses on defense, but nothing is really done so much about entitlement. I personally have zero faith in the Super Committee. I don't have any faith in a smaller version of Congress doing what Congress couldn't do already. So because of that, and just because we watched Democrats walk away last week from the plan that Republicans, that Toomey put forward just last week. He threw them a curveball, $300 billion in revenues raising. But I think it comes down to an ideological difference. They want Bush tax cuts to be made permanent. They want to increase revenues by adding to the tax base as opposed to just jacking up the rates, which I think is valid, especially when you look at tax receipts for the past 6 decades. And so there's an ideological difference here. But in terms of how this is going to affect us and whether or not we have faith, I don't know how it will. We'll wait and see, and I have zero faith.
John, is this going to be something that we're just going to have to wait for the next election, this whole idea of cutting the spending and getting the deficit under control?
Well, George made a really critical point I think a lot of people don't really realize, which is these automatic cuts that take place if the Super Committee fails don't happen until 2013. What are the odds of them really happening? I mean, Congress can simply vote them away during the lame duck session after the 2012. So what is this, just an exercise in futility? Well, it's profoundly disappointing, and I think that if they fail, the cost will be borne by incumbents everywhere. This is an indictment of Congress. It's an indictment of both parties, and it's an indictment of the White House.
That's the crucial point, because Harry Reid's interests diverge from Barack Obama's interests here. Harry Reid is defending 23 Senate seats, and he does not want his Democratic candidates for Senate to be out there while the president is campaigning against a do-nothing failed Congress.
Right. But I just want to go back to Toomey's proposal. While it was a modest recognition that revenues need to be increased,
$500 billion is not modest.
But look, compared to allowing the Bush tax cuts to expire, $800 billion. I mean, come on. We're looking at, proposals that would cut entitlements, cut Medicare, cut programs on people who can least afford them.
You knew the Republicans were going to go along with allowing the Bush tax cuts to expire. I mean, this was the first significant movement forward for Republicans on revenue, besides what John Boehner did with the president in their secret discussions.
Well, the Democrats have already moved on entitlement. So why can't we just find the $1 or $2 trillion more that will allow us to achieve balance?
Let's talk a little bit about mood, which inevitably governs all these kind of debates and discussions. We saw over this last week with elections in various different states, various conservative ideas pushed back, whether it was anti-union measures in Ohio or other such things elsewhere. And some have called it a reaction to conservative overreach. How much can one read into this?
Well, I'd be careful in reading too much. Clearly, conservatives lost in those two initiatives you mentioned. But look at the health care mandate in Ohio. Ohio voted overwhelmingly, every county in the state, to reject the centerpiece of the president's health care plan, and by a bigger margin than the referendum that put away Kasich's plan on collective bargaining. So I would be careful in reading much. In fact, if anything, this was an incumbent election. I mean, incumbents did pretty well across the board, and that's a troubling sign for conservatives and for the Tea Party movement, because it means the momentum has waned.
So the momentum, George, right down to the latest Quinnipiac poll, is basically saying that the new state poll out of Iowa is showing President Obama defeating all Republican comers in that new poll. Shift of mood? It's a swing state, isn't it?
It's a swing state. It's a purple state. It's early.
And I actually meant Ohio. I hope I didn't say Iowa.
You did, but doesn't
I meant Ohio.
They're all swing states.
Iowa's important, too.
Lack of glasses.
Well, Ohio's important to Republicans.
That's what I mean.
No Republican has ever won the presidency without carrying Ohio. The Republicans always spend something like the gross national product of Brazil to carry Ohio, and that puts them across the finish line. The real problem for Republicans is they have to have a candidate who can carry the white, non-college educated, blue-collar vote. Mm-hmm. Hillary Democrats, if you will, used to be called Reagan Democrats. They're in play, and the Republicans need a candidate who can carry them. They lost them in Ohio last week.
Well, let me just say this. More people turned out to vote against Governor Kasich's proposals than voted for Governor Kasich in 2010. This is a sign of things to come. Voters are sick and tired and frustrated of politicians overreaching, basically doing things that they did not elect them to do. They want jobs. They want to protect the economy. They're not interested in all of these side issues, whether it's a personhood amendment in Mississippi or the voter proposal in Maine and the anti-worker proposal in Ohio. And also, remember, in the Hawkeye state, in Iowa, they also rejected one of the Tea Party-backed candidates who had proposed, was against the marriage initiative. So this was a good day for Democrats.